Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the SAIEE Lightning Chapter webinar on multiple strike point lightning flashes. Are we underestimating our lightning risk? Before we start, a few webinar considerations. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on your device. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the questions panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with attendees. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other, however, are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the SAIEE TV channel on YouTube. You will find the registration link in the chat box. Please register so you'll receive notification. And you also register, it's free. And this recording will appear under the Lightning Chapter playlist. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few weeks after this webinar, once we have received a CPD validation number from EXA. I'd like to introduce you now to our host for tonight, Dr. Hugh Hunt, who's the chairman of the Lightning Chapter and is also a senior lecturer in the School of Electrical and Information Engineering at the University of Witwatersrand. He was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and completed his PhD at the University of Witwatersrand, looking at the use of lightning location system data in forensic investigations. He has worked with the South African Lightning Detection Network and Brazil with the RINDAT system. Dr. Hunt currently heads the Johannesburg Lightning Research Laboratory, and he is, as I mentioned, the chairperson of the Lightning Chapter. Over to you, Hugh.
Thanks very much, Minx, and thank you for the welcome. And I will issue the same to all our attendees. Welcome to the our Lightning Chapter webinar, Multiple Strike Point Lightning Flashes, and Are We Underestimating Our Lightning Risk? I think we've got a very interesting presentation today on this topic, which really centers around the idea of what many of us will know as flash density, and our metric in which we try to estimate how much lightning might occur in a region in order to assess the risk. And for many years, there's been the discussion around the possibility of including forked lightning flashes or lightning flashes that have multiple termination points to the ground. And is that necessary to include that in these risk calculations? And as those of you who are aware of the updates happening to the 62305 protection standard will be aware that there's some recommendations about trying to estimate ground strike point lightning density. What's very interesting is that this year alone, there have been 3 publications that actually look at producing ground strike density maps for South Africa, for all of Europe, and then the United States. And so we're now at a point in which we can actually start to really assess this discussion metric, or the discussion around this metric. And that has led us to this webinar today to hear from the authors of these papers so we can understand what they've observed and with the overall observation of does this inclusion of multiple strike points actually yield a better estimation of risk, or have we been underestimating our risk? Just some logistics for the evening. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the first presenter, and then he'll present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a very brief question session, answer some of the questions that might have come up during his presentation. 3 to 4 questions we'll tackle, and then we'll move on to our second presenter. Similarly, we'll handle some of the questions, and then we'll move to our third presenter, do the last few questions, and then we'll open it up to a more general question session where we can ask any further questions in light of all 3 presentations. For those of you, just to note, if you have a question to ask, just post it in the question box that comes along with your GoToWebinar control panel. I will then be able to see those questions, and then during the question sessions, I will pose the questions to the presenters. Also, just to please note, on your control panel, you'll see there's 2 handouts. One is the latest issue of the What Now magazine, which contains a What Now article on the subject as well, and then also the 2024 Academy brochure. And if you open up the chat section, you will also find a number of important links to become an SAIEE member, to apply for CPD points and similar. Right, with that said, I think we'll move on to our first presenter. So our first presenter is Mr. Saneli Kikaba. Saneli is an electrical engineer currently working as a systems engineer at Gibela Rail Consortium. He obtained his MSc Eng in electrical engineering from the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and is currently pursuing his PhD in electrical engineering at the same institution. His research focuses on enhancing lightning risk estimation through spatially adaptive scaling factors. Thank you, Saneli, and please
Thank you.
Begin.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Hugh. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we are seeing that.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Greetings, everyone. So today I'll be presenting a topic titled the ground strike point density map of South Africa. In particular, I will be exploring the question at hand, whether are we underestimating the lightning risk. So during the presentation, we'll cover the following points. I'll provide an overview of the lightning risk in South Africa to set the context. I'll also define some of the key differences between the concepts of a lightning stroke, a ground strike point, and a flash. I'll then present a high-level overview of some of the results from the high-speed video observations that were conducted in South Africa, Brazil, and the USA. After that, I'll present the ground strike point density map of South Africa and its implications, and then wrap up the presentation with the conclusion. So cloud-ground lightning discharges in particular pose the greatest threat to people and infrastructure. So in South Africa, Eskom, which is the national power utility, has attributed about 24% of its transmission line faults to lightning discharges. As early as 2005 already, we had insurance claims relating to lightning damages amounting to approximately 500 million per year. Sadly, also the recorded mean rate in terms of the death rates due to lightning discharges are at 1.5 per million population in urban areas and 8.8 per million population in rural areas, which is 4 times higher than the global average. So this underscores the importance of accurately estimating the lightning risk to guide effective lightning protection strategies. So according to the SAIEE 62305-2, which is on the protection against lightning, in particular part 2 refers to the risk management. The risk is defined as the product of the number of dangerous events. This is currently the lightning flash density is used for this. And then the PX, which is the probability of damage to a structure, and then we have LX, which is the consequential loss. So over the years, the number of lightning flash density, in fact, the flash density parameter, which is has been estimated using the Chironic level, which refers to the number of thunderstorm days had. Also, there has been improvement in technology where we've also used flash counters, and currently we're using the lightning location system, which is referred to as the South African Lightning Detection Network. This is owned and operated by the South African Weather Service. So the South African Lightning Detection Network was commissioned in 2006, and has evolved to the current arrangement where we have 26 Vaisela Inc. centers. So these are at a baseline of 150 kilometers. The 26th center is the one that is located at Eswatini. So the sensors use a combination of the magnetic direction finding as well as the time of arrival technology. So it uses a combination of these through what is known as the impact, which is the improved accuracy through combined technology to both detect and geolocate electromagnetic radiation of a lightning stroke. So in terms of the system performance, this is defined by the detection efficiency, which is referred, which defines the number of lightning events, either strokes or flash detected versus the actual lightning events. So also the stroke detection efficiency has been measured at 72.1%, where also the flash detection efficiency has been measured at 88.3%. This is based on 71 high-speed video observations by the Johannesburg Lightning Research Laboratory on both the Syntec and the Hillbrow Tower. The latest studies by the Johannesburg Lightning Research Laboratory involved evaluation of other tall buildings across South Africa. So this has indicated that we have a location accuracy of 150 meters for the system. So the output of the South African Lightning Detection Network then is data as shown. So some of the key parameters include the stroke date and time, as you can see. It also includes the location of the geolocated and detected stroke, as well as the peak current measurements for the stroke. So the IEC 62858 also details the computation procedure for lightning density based on lightning location systems, and the standard defines what constitutes a flash. And I think this is key to the issue at hand. So it defines a flash as a strokes within a second of the first written stroke. So if strokes occur within a second of the first written stroke, and the strokes that occur within 10 kilometers from the first written stroke, also where the time interval is within 500 milliseconds between the successive strokes, we then call those strokes, or those strokes then form part of a flash. And that flash is then characterized by just the location, the date, time, and the peak current of the first written stroke. So the minimum thresholds around the ground flash density in terms in square kilometers per year, also the observation period to be considered, and the area of cells to be considered to derive the map is based on this standard. Additionally, the size in terms of the period for the data set of 10 years minimum is depicted. Also, based on the standard, then we have the official South African national lightning ground density map, which you might be familiar with. So at a very high level, the map shows high flash density in Mpumalanga area, also the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal areas, where there's minimal lightning activity, little to no lightning activity within the Western Cape area. Now, to get to the root of the issue, let's go through some of the key concept of a stroke, a ground strike point, and a flash. So cloud ground discharges begins with charge separation on a thundercloud. So various theories in literature have described how this phenomena comes about. However, what we know is that following that, you then have preliminary breakdown that results into the formation and propagation of a stepped leader. Ultimately, you then have a connecting leader attaching to a step leader, and then you have a return stroke on a strike point. So you have a ground strike point as indicated there. So what could also happen is that this would potentially also disappear, and you then have a dart leader that can form and attach on the same ground strike point. So then in that case, you have a subsequent stroke number 2 on the same ground strike point. So within the same or even another thundercloud, you can have another subsequent stroke as shown, terminating on a different ground strike point, which is ground strike point number 2. So in this case, what we're indicating is that we have 3 lightning strokes, 2 ground strike points, and a single flash. Okay, so the table shows some of the literature results in terms of that were based on high-speed video observations in South Africa, Brazil, and the US. So based on these independent studies, it is shown that on average, as you can see in terms of the ground strike point per flash, on average, we have more flashes per square kilometer per year. In South Africa, when 490 flashes were studied, 626 ground strike points were found. This translates to 1.29 ground strike points per flash. In southeastern Brazil, where 138 flashes were studied, 235 ground strike points were found. And for the USA, where 386 flashes were studied, we had 558 ground strike points, indicating that you have 1.45 ground strike points per flash. To show it in a different light, again, this is the 2017 South African Lightning Detection Network stroke data, which was correlated with ground truth observation from high-speed cameras. These were placed around Johannesburg. So here you've got 6 strokes that are indicated and 2 ground strike points that were observed. So what you can also see from this image is that the strokes are not aligned to the observed strike points, and this can be attributed to the location accuracy indicated earlier. And however, but what we are indicating here is that you can have a multiple strokes within a flash and also multiple ground strike points. So the problem at hand is that the flash density parameter assumes that a single ground strike point per flash assumes a single ground strike point per flash, and as a result may underestimate the lighting risk in an area. So noting this has led to some of the proposals to adjust the ground flash density parameter by a scaling factor to derive the ground strike point as shown in the equation. So in this equation, typically F will be equals to 2, and this is considered based on some of the standard ground truth observations that have been observed across different countries. Also, the correcting factor is a very quick method and can be quite useful for lightning protection designers. However, you might note that this is very generic and with an assumption that there is a single constant factor that is relating the flash density with the ground strike point across the entire region considered. So there have also been ground strike point algorithms, on the other hand, which have been proven to provide accuracy is up to 90% when deriving strike points from the lightning detection network stroke data. So in this study in particular, we've used an algorithm by Matsui, which he had used on the Japanese lightning detection network to derive ground strike points. So the algorithm in the study operates on the South African lightning detection network data. For this purpose, we used data from July 2007 to July 2016. So at the time, this was the only pre-processed data that was available for the study. So the data is then clustered into flashes as per the IEC 62858 and is indicated earlier. So each stroke of a flash is then iterated through, where the distance is within a defined limits between strokes. In particular, we use 150 meters. In our case, this is based on the location accuracy also indicated earlier. Together with the error ellipse data, where the ellipses that intersect with and the strokes that are within a distance form a single ground strike point, and the ground strike point is then described by the average location of the strokes in each of the cluster. So in terms of the results, this is the lightning flash distribution that we receive. So the pattern shown depict relatively high levels of lightning activity in the central eastern parts of South Africa, especially in regions between the southern part of Mpumalanga and the northern part of KwaZulu-Natal. So the highest recorded number of flashes per square kilometer per year is 47 in this case. This shows the same density pattern as the official map also shown earlier, but there is a slight difference in terms of magnitudes. So the same data set was then used to compute the ground strike point density as shown based on the algorithm. So the lightning pattern again from the GSP density map shows that the magnitude in terms of the ground strike point density per square kilometer per year, that we have a maximum of 78 ground strike points in the same area where we had the highest flash density that was previously shown on the previous slide, and this was in Mpumalanga. So to quantify the extent at which we are underestimating the the risk. So the flash density grid was then subtracted, from the ground strike point density grid as shown. In terms of the result, the difference density shown, it shows a relatively very high difference in lightning density in areas around the central eastern parts of South Africa, again, as you can see there. So particularly if you look into the borders between KwaZulu-Natal, Free State, as well as the Mpumalanga regions. So the regions around these areas which show high ground flash density and GSP density also have exhibited a high difference per square kilometer. You can see there we've got a minimum of 0 per square kilometer per year, indicating that there are regions in which the flash to GSP ratio is a 1:1. So this is likely due to many of the single lightning stroke flashes that were found on the data set. So the results show a maximum difference of 32, as you can see from the stats, contact points per square kilometers per year. And this is in a region located in Mpumalanga. So this is a different location than where we had the high ground flash density and the ground strike point density. So the location in particular is 38 kilometers southwest of Piet Retief, which has historically shown very high lightning density. Again, important to note is that in this area, we have altitudes that range between 1,800 meters to 2,200. So these are high altitude areas. Again, if you check the northern Cape part, where predominantly we would install PV plants by independent power producers due to conditions such as solar irradiance and the area being open and flat, etc. Based on the difference that we're seeing, for instance, the higher lightning strike points are shown compared to the flash density parameter. So in this case, we might have potentially underestimate the lightning risk in that particular area. Okay, so we also checked how the constant scaling factor compares to the ground strike point algorithm. Shown in the slide is a difference density map for a scaled flash density. We've used the scaling factor of 1.56. This is based on the average ground strike points per flash observed in South Africa, Austria, Brazil, and the USA. So the stats show that on average, when a constant scaling factor is used, there's a small difference with the ground strike point density derived from the ground strike point algorithm. So this implies that the scaling factor does not significantly overestimate or underestimate the ground strike point density over the whole region, even though it may do so in specific region, for instance, where the picture shows a high difference. So a scaling factor can thus provide a reasonable estimate for lightning protection system designers, where processing ground strike point from flash data will take time. So a quick question that we are currently evaluating is there an area-specific factor that can further minimize this difference for lightning protection system designers, considering the complexity of the algorithms that were shown, the time taken to implement these? For instance, the data set between July 2007 and July 2016 was processed on a high-speed computing cluster, took over 3 days per season, and based on the minimum requirement of 10 years data, you're looking at almost a month to complete the entire processing on a high speed on high speed computers. So in conclusion, the ground flash density parameter has been noted to underestimate the lightning risk across the South African landscape. In particular, the lightning detection network ground truth observation based scaling factor can provide a reasonable sufficient lightning risk estimation where there are data constraints as indicated. So for further details in terms of the study, you can have a look at the article underestimating lightning risk due to multiple ground strike points. Thanks you.
Thank you very much, Sanelli. That's very interesting, and thank you for the presentation. Now, I would suggest if there are some questions for Sanelli, we can tackle a couple of those now. Nothing has been posted in the question section yet, but if anyone has a question, please go ahead. Marianne Cooper says, excellent, well done.
Thank you.
I'll give it a few moments if anyone else wants to pop a question in there. Mike Fisser asks, did I understand correctly? The factor F was 2.
Yes, so that's the generic standard for a scaling factor, and this is based on the ground truth observations. If you would have seen from the slide where I show ground truth observations across South Africa, Austria, and the US, that you can have an estimate of around 2 when you look into that ground truth observation.
But the factor you had in your figure, I don't think was 2.
Okay. Oh no, it was 1.56, not 2 exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's based on the ground truth observations in South Africa, Austria, and the US.
Great. A question from Julian Fisser saying, do the locators cover all of South Africa?
Yes, no, they do. We've got 26 locators across South Africa.
And then Marianne Cooper says, now I see why we get such a high number of injury reports from KZN. And yes, Marianne, that would be true. It's definitely a high density there. It's a peak in the Southern African area. There's a question from Professor Jan de Kock. Is the SA Weather Service the only lightning detection system in SA? If not, how do the other systems' results compare to SAIEE's?
Yeah, for this study, we use the South African Lightning Detection Network system. I know that we might have other location systems around, but for the study, we used only the South African Lightning Detection Network.
Great. And then a question from Jose Claudio de Silva. Aren't lightning current parameters influenced by the use of GSP instead of GFD?
Okay, can you repeat that question here?
Aren't lightning current parameters influenced by the use of GSP instead of GFD? So I think what he's asking there is if you look at the distribution of peak currents,
yes,
if you just take the first stroke as the of a flash, then you'll get a certain peak, a certain median peak current.
Yes.
But if you now break it down into GSPs, you might get a different picture. So it's a good question, and I don't know if there's a clear answer to that.
Yeah, no. I think we'll have to look into that.
Okay, I'll take one more question here, and then we'll save the rest for the end of the session. There's a question from Professor Alistair Clulo. Can SALDN detect cloud-to-cloud strikes?
Yes, it does. However, there is, I think, some pre-processing that typically would happen to ensure that there is a level of accuracy, and we're able to distinguish between the cloud lightning discharges and the cloud ground lightning discharges. So that's based on peak current measurements, etc. Yes.
Great. I'm going to move to our next presenter. There are a couple of questions in the chat there, but we'll get to them at the final session. So our next presenter now is Mr. Dieter Poelman. Dieter Poelman was born in Ghent, Belgium in 1980. He earned his BSc and his MSc in mathematics from the University of Ghent, after which he completed a doctoral degree in astronomy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In late 2009, he transitioned into a dynamic role as a lightning scientist at the Royal Meteorological Institute of Belgium, RMIB. He has been instrumental in overseeing the operational aspects of the Belgian Lightning Location System, known as BELS, and is engaged in conducting scientific research using the data generated by BELS. Since the end of 2023, he has taken up the role of lead of the ground-based remote sensing section at RMIB, overseeing observations based on weather radar and lightning, nowcasting, crowdsourcing, and novel data sources for meteorology. Dieter, thank you very much for joining us today, and please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm first waiting for the slides to appear on the screen. Yeah. So thank you for the introduction. So my name is Dieter Poelman, as you've heard, and I'm going to speak about some ground strike point, a ground strike point study we've conducted some time ago in Europe based on the Euclid lightning location system. So next slide, please. Yeah, and again, a next slide. So I first want to show you or let you know that the results presented in the coming minutes are based on a recent publication with the same title, but I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, who are Hannes Koolman and Wolfgang Schulz from the Aldis company in Vienna in Austria. Next, please. Next slide. Oh yeah, sorry. Could you go back? Yeah. Was my mistake. One slide back. Yes. Okay. So we've heard already from the previous speaker, SAIEE, that in order to evaluate a lightning risk to a particular structure, it is common practice to use the guidelines set out in IEC 62305-2. And as mentioned as well, one of the key parameters is the flash density. But of course, per definition, a flash has only one termination point, one ground strike point, which is the first stroke within a flash. So flash, as well explained by SAIEE, a flash can consist of multiple strokes, can be as well a single stroke flash, but also a multiple stroke flash. But it's only the first stroke that is considered the termination point of a flash. And we know that based on high-speed video camera observations, that flashes really do have multiple strokes within a flash, and as well we see on the video cameras, you can see that they have multiple termination points. And so what we did in this study, we used a certain ground strike point algorithm, which will be introduced a bit later on. And we ingested the Euclid data. So Euclid is a European Corporation for Lightning Detection Network. And then we could study the spatial and the temporal behavior of ground strike points within Europe. So next slide, please. Yes, so here you can see what the Euclid network is. So Euclid, as I said before, stands for the European Corporation for Lightning Detection. And it currently operates about 170 sensors, low frequency sensors, the same type of sensors as in the previous presentation of the South African Lightning Detection Network. Of course, a network evolves over time. This network already exists about 30 years, but it evolves by upgrading sensors on sensor software or even the hardware, or you add new sensors at certain places, or you relocate sensors. But I just want to say that the Euclid network is really a network that is continuously looked after in terms of performance evaluation. We do that based on high-speed video cameras and also based on instrumented towers, such as the Geesberg Tower. And so we have a fairly good idea of the performance of this network. And we can say that the median location accuracy is around 100 meters. We have a stroke detection efficiency of 84% and a flash detection efficiency of 98% based on these video and electric field measurements. And so in this study, we used data over 10 years from 2013 till 2022. So next slide, please. Yes, so now a little bit more about the ground strike point algorithm that we've used. It's a different one than in the previous presentation. So it's as well also an iterative k-means method, and we simply loop through the strokes in the flash, whereby the location of the first stroke is the location also of the first ground strike point. And then the subsequent strokes are assigned to a certain ground strike point if the distance falls within a certain distance threshold, which we can set like we want. And if not, the stroke creates a new ground strike point. And after the last stroke, after you went through all the strokes in your flash, the position of each ground strike point is updated based on the average of the positions of the assigned strokes, inversely weighted by their respective semi-major axis. And then you start a new iteration until the locations of the ground strike points do not vary anymore. And this algorithm takes also care of strokes that are poorly located in terms of the semi-major axis or in terms of their absolute peak current. So strokes with a semi-major axis larger than 2 kilometer or an absolute peak current which is smaller than 6 kiloamperes are automatically assigned to the previous ground strike point because those strokes are believed to be poorly located, and we do not want to create artificial ground strike points. Next slide. Yeah, so how does this algorithm performs? So in 2021, we wrote a paper as well together with Hugh Hunt, looking into different ground strike point algorithms. And we found that using a distance threshold of 500 meters, the success rate of this particular algorithm, but also the ones presented in the presentation before, have success rates up to 90% to retrieve correctly the correct type of the stroke in the flash. So meaning whether a channel creates a new ground contact point or follows a pre-existing channel. And then we followed this study up with a conference proceeding in 2023, not looking at the success rates of how good you can correctly assign the stroke type, but just looking based on how well can you find the exact amount of ground strike points. And so we did that by just looking at the ratio of the number of ground strike points retrieved by the algorithm divided by the number of ground strike points based on the ground truth video camera data. We find that for this particular algorithm, it underestimates the actual number of ground strike points by only 5%. Next slide. Okay, so now there's a series of spatial plots. So what we see here is the flash density within the Euclid network based on 10 years data, 2013 till 2022. And you can show already directly the next slides, which is then the density of the ground strike points. One slide back, please. Yes. So now we are looking at the GSP density within Europe, and what you see, if you still had in mind the flash density map, is that the GSP density patterns really resemble the ones of the underlying flash density, which is as expected. The highest ground strike point densities are located near the Adriatic Sea and the Western Balkan, with a maximum of 8.5 ground strike points per square kilometer per year. Next slide, please. So here we look at the average number of ground strike points per flash. And you can see directly that over the Mediterranean Sea, over the Baltic Sea and the Adriatic Sea, there's an increase of the average number of ground strike points with respect to the value found over land. So over the sea, we find an average of about 1.5, which is a little bit larger than the value of 1.3 average number of ground strike points per flash over mainland Europe. So that's something to keep in mind, but of course there's something behind it, because we should look as well to the multiplicity distribution. And with the multiplicity, I mean the number of strokes per flash. If your multiplicity is higher, then of course the probability of creating more ground strike points is also higher. stroke with, let's say, a flash with 10 strokes has a higher probability of creating multiple ground strike points compared to a flash with only 2 strokes. So that you can see in the next slides, that's the multiplicity distribution plotted next to this figure you're seeing. So next slide, please. Yes. So we see here on the right the mean multiplicity distribution, and you can see again, one slide back. Could you go back one slide, please? Yes. So you can see that there's a kind of one-to-one match between the mean multiplicity and the average number of ground strike points per flash over the seas. The multiplicity increased also to a lesser extent also over the Baltic Sea. Okay, and so we go to the next slide, which will show the median separation distance of ground strike points within a flash. So of course, if you use a ground strike point algorithm, you know the locations of your ground strike points after your algorithm finished. And so with this information, you can calculate the median separation distance amongst the different ground strike points in a flash. We found that the median separation distance is 2.3 kilometers, with the 10th percentile being 900 meters and the 90th percentile 5.5 kilometers. Next slide, please. And what is striking is that over the Alps and over the Pyrenees, there seemed to be a decrease in the separation distance. And we thought a little bit about it, and we think we come up with a valuable explanation, being that if you would assume, if you assume a constant height of the preliminary breakdown and consider that the lightning leaders are a little bit inclined, this means that because you're in a mountainous regions, the path length of your lightning channel is smaller over the Pyrenees and the Alps. Hence, the distances will be also shorter amongst the different ground strike points within a flash. Next slide, please. And you could go already 2 or 3 slides further. Yeah. One more. And one more. And then I will explain it, what we are seeing. So, okay. Now, it's always nice to see these spatial plots over the whole Europe, but I wanted to zoom in on a very interesting region, which is the one we are seeing here. And it has the Alps in the north of the plots, large parts of Italy. We see Sardinia and Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea. And in fact, what we wanted to do is to exclude the influence of the multiplicity in the average number of ground strike points per flash. So on the top left plots, we only used we only extracted flashes with a multiplicity of 2, so 2 strokes within the flash. In the middle plot, we only used flashes with a multiplicity of 3, and on the right plot, flashes with a multiplicity of 4, and you can do this for higher multiplicity flashes as well. But what you can see is that in all those cases, so for a fixed multiplicity, you see that there's a drop over the Alps in the average number of ground strike points per flash. You can see as well that for Sardinia and Corsica, which are relatively small islands, there's a big difference between those islands and the surrounding Mediterranean Sea. In the Mediterranean Sea, the average number of ground strike points per flash is higher. And so when I looked at those plots first, I thought, this looks very similar. And so I thought, let's plot as well. And you can go to the next slide. So this slide, you can stay on this slide. You can, one slide back, please. Yes, so now we are looking at the bottom plots in this on this slide. So I remember in 2016 I wrote also a paper based on Euclid data, and there I plotted some spatial plots of the peak currents, peak current amplitudes of negative cloud to ground flashes, and it looked a bit similar to me as those 3 upper plots. So what I did now here in those bottom plots, I plotted the peak current of the ground strike points, which is the bottom left plot. So, and per definition, the peak current of a ground strike point is the peak current of the first stroke assigned to that ground strike point. And the bottom right plot plots the subsequent strokes within a ground strike point. And you can see on both of those figures that also over the Alps, there's the peak current drops a bit. Over the Mediterranean Sea, the peak current increases. And what is nice to see is that Sardinia and Corsica has a median peak current, which is lower compared to the surrounding Mediterranean Sea. And this is, I think, maybe related to the question of that person from the previous presentation. So I think there's, or at least we see there's kind of a link between the peak currents and the amount of ground strike points per flash. Now you can go to the next slide, please. So now we stop looking at these looking at those spatial plots, but we look at a little bit more on a temporal scale. So on this plot, I plot as well the average number of ground strike points as a function of hour through the day, which is the black solid line. And if you exclude single stroke flashes, then of course your average number of ground strike points increases, which is then the highest line, the dotted black line. And in gray, I plot the absolute peak current of ground strike points. And you can see that, for the average number of ground strike points, there's a minimum between, let's say, noon and 6 p.m. But you can see the same behavior. It's like a one-to-one relation between the average number of ground strike points and the peak current behavior as well. And if you go to the next slide, I do the same, but on a monthly scale. Yes, so that's here. So again, the black solid line shows the average number of ground strike points per flash as a function of month. And in gray, for the peak currents, the absolute value of the peak currents. And you can see that the relationship is not as good as on the hourly scale, but still, let's say if you look between April and November, there's an increase in the number of average number of ground strike points per flash, and there's also an increase in the absolute value of the peak current. So there seems to be a common or how to say a common root, or that is causing the behavior of ground strike points and peak currents. It seems to be linked to each other. Although in this study we didn't went much further into that. We just showed what we observed, but a real physical meaning behind it we didn't really found. Okay, and so we come to the conclusion in the next slide. So if you ingest large amounts of data from a lightning location system, in this case 10 years, and that's what's typically used, the 10 years of data. If you ingest that in a ground strike point algorithm, you can really, on a large temporal scale and a spatial scale, you can study those characteristics. And so what we found is that over the sea, remember the Mediterranean Sea, Adriatic Sea, and the Baltic Sea, the average number of ground strike points is slightly higher compared to over land in Europe. There seems to be a link between the average number of ground strike points per flash and the peak current, as I've shown in the previous slides. And what is very nice is that it really pops out that mountainous regions such as the Alps or in the Pyrenees, there's a different behavior of the ground strike points, resulting in a lower amount of ground strike points per flash, and also, which I think is very nice to see, a smaller separation distance between the different ground strike points within a flash. Now, within the Euclid domain, the maximum amount of ground strike points per flash on average is smaller than 1.6. Over C, it's 1.5. So, and this factor of 2 has been mentioned also in the previous presentation. So if you would use that factor of 2 to estimate the ground strike point density based on the flash density, you would overestimate the risk. And if you use only the flash density, you would underestimate the risk. So I would suggest, of course, to use good ground strike point algorithm, but of course, the data that you ingest in your ground strike point algorithm should be of higher value. So those, for instance, the Euclid network, the South African network, NLDM in the USA, these are very good networks with very good location accuracy and performance, high performance in stroke detection C and flash detection Cs and so on. So with this, I would like to end my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dieter. That was very interesting. And we've got a question here, and I'm sure a couple more will pop in. The first question talks to what you talked about there, but does altitude affect the ground strike points per flash?
Yes, so that's what I've shown in the Alps. In Europe, we have the Alps and the Pyrenees, which are of course those mountainous regions. And we see there's a different behavior of the ground strike points compared to the immediate surrounding of those mountains. So yes, mountains have an effect on the behavior of the ground strike points.
I think it's an interesting observation, and SAIEE must just pull up his map again, but I don't think in the South African map we see that sort of reduction in ground strike points as much as you do.
Okay.
So that point where it has the highest density there in South Africa is also a fairly mountainous region. So we must look at it. I think SAIEE will need to look at it in more detail, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I think
I'm not sure if we see quite the same effect in South Africa. So that's an interesting thing to note.
I think in the past, Ken Cummins, but I'm not sure which year of the publication, maybe 2014 or maybe a bit later. He also looked into the ground strike points over mountain ridge in America, and I think he found out as well there's a different behavior of those ground strike points compared to lower areas. Yeah. And of course, if you're in mountainous areas, those peaks can attract those peaks can attract your lightning channel towards the same peak, so that also has a consequence that lowers as well the number of ground strike points per flash.
And I suspect the storm behavior and how that comes to the mountains also plays a role in these things.
Yeah.
There's another question here saying, what is your formula used versus the SAIEE formula? Not sure exactly which formula that's being referred to.
So
but
we didn't use any formula. So we used a different ground strike point algorithm. That's the only difference between the two studies. And so the formula presented by SAIEE was just the formula within the IEC 62305-2. That is what people use, but I haven't applied this formula within the study.
Thanks. There's a question here from Daniel Duval saying, what impact does the type of rock found in the mountains have on lightning strikes? This is a question that's often asked.
Something I am not able to answer. I certainly didn't look into that type of question.
Yeah, I don't think there is a neat answer to that, but I think many people have tried, but it's not an easy thing to. Right. Then a question from Claudio. The correlation found between GSP and peak current are just for the peak current of the first return stroke. Does it include other strokes, those involved in the other strike points?
So yes, so if you remember those two bottom plots on that slide, so the left bottom plot showed the peak current of the ground strike point, which is the first stroke in the ground strike point, and the right plot, bottom plot, showed the peak current of the subsequent strokes within the ground strike point. Yes, this is what I'm talking about. And so for both those different peak currents, you see there's a correlation between the behavior of ground strike points and the peak current. And there's a drop over the Alps. There's an increase over the Adriatic, Adriatic and the Mediterranean Sea, and a drop over Corsica and Sardinia. So which you also see in the behavior of the ground strike points.
Okay, I think I will end with questions for right now for you, Dieter, and we'll move on to Chris's presentation. And then if there are any last questions at the end, we'll take those. So our next presenter is Chris Vergasky, and Chris Vergasky is the manager of the Wisconsin Environmental Mesonet, WiscoNet, a network of weather and soil monitoring stations across Wisconsin, and a member of the National Lightning Safety Council. Chris holds a bachelor's degree in operational meteorology and a master's in applied meteorology. He's an active member of the American Meteorological Society and the National Weather Association. In addition to developing WiscoNet, Chris conducts research with lightning data, including its use in safety applications and lightning in volcanic eruptions. He helps cities, businesses, and other organizations improve weather communication and preparedness. Chris, thank you very much, and please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you all for attending. Thanks for putting this together. Now we'll come across the Atlantic Ocean and talk about developing ground strike point density maps for the United States. I'm not really wanting to rehash a lot of things that have been discussed in Dieter and Sanelli's presentations, but a lot of the same things will apply. We'll just look at it in a different way, and we'll start with a couple of videos actually showing the differences between flashes, strokes, ground strike points. This first video comes from just outside of Houston, Texas, here in the southern United States. These are two multi-stroke lightning flashes that have single strike points. You can see that each stroke comes down the same in these 10 to 12 stroke flashes, come channel and hits the same point on the ground. We're making the assumption that it's the exact same point on the ground based on the horizon is covered there, but they're coming down the same channel and hitting the same point. And then this video from Wyoming, which is showing a 5 or 6 stroke flash with multiple ground strike points. We'll let this just cycle through again. This kind of illustrates the points that have been made in the previous presentations, where you can have these multiple stroke flashes that hit the ground in different strike points. This still image here shows that Wyoming lightning flash with 5 strokes that hit in 3 or 4 different strike points. The first stroke, second stroke, third stroke, fourth and fifth are labeled there with where they made contact with the ground. And so we've talked about a number that you would apply to a flash density to get a strike point density, and using a number of around 2. If you look at a 1 and a 4 here, that kind of comes to around a 2 factor that you could use, but we'll see that that's not necessarily the case. So we're using the National Lightning Detection Network, which uses the same detection techniques as the Euclid network and the South African Lightning Network to create our maps here in the United States. And the performance of NLDN far exceeds the requirements set in the IEC standard to be able to do these computations. You can see the NLDN performance there in the center column with a 97% or better flash detection efficiency, an 84-meter median location accuracy, and better than 85% classification accuracy for cloud to ground or in cloud lightning, with the references there as well if you really want to dive into that. And because of the performance, we can then cluster CG strokes into the ground strike points. So this is an example from California on the west coast of the United States of an 8-stroke flash with multiple ground strike points. You'd see the different colored ellipses for the 1 and 2 strokes, the 3 and 4 strokes, 5, 6, and 7, and the 8th stroke there. So this again is just illustrating the the capabilities of a lightning detection network to be able to classify this, and it kind of shows the algorithm that we use. In this case, it's very similar to the South African algorithm, where we look at the overlap of the confidence ellipses for each stroke, and if there's sufficient overlap of confidence ellipses of the various strokes, we can cluster those into the ground strike points, and then give a location of where that strike point would be. So in this case, an 8-stroke flash with four different strike points. So we've looked back at about 6 years of data from 2017 through 2022. This encompasses the duration between 2017 and 2022 after the latest upgrade of the National Lightning Detection Network, which allowed for improvements in in-cloud classification, up to the most recent algorithm update of the National Lightning Detection Network, which improved the location algorithm, among some other things. There's a paper from Murphy et al. That really dives into that in JTech from the American Meteorological Society, if you really want to dive into the algorithm. So we reprocessed all of the lightning data between 2017 and 2022 to run on the same location algorithm to go through and allow us to really have a robust performance of the ground strike point algorithm. You see the varying trends in lightning counts over the years, and including this really down year in 2020, which potentially related to some COVID related things with cleaner air, but definitely something that requires some more study and understanding to see just why 2020 was such a significant downturn. But what you see there is an average of 55.4 million strokes per year, with those clustered into about 23.4 million flashes per year, with around 36.8 million ground strike points per year. The number of flashes being around 23.4 million, this really validates a number that has been given for how much lightning strikes the United States every year. A number of around 25 million has been given going back to the 1990s. We couldn't really find an initial source of where that value came from, so it was really good to see that the number that we've actually calculated of around 23.4 million really helps to validate the number that's been given for around 30 years. And we end up with a multiplicity of around 2.4 with a ground strike points per flash of around 1.6. If you break that down by positive and negative, around 2.7 multiplicity for negative strokes, and a 1.2 multiplicity for positive strokes, and 1.69 ground strike points per flash for the negatives, with 1.15 for the positives. I'll point out that this does not include strokes that maybe have a forked connection with the ground. This is only showing those very detectable changes in ground strike point location. So I don't think that was mentioned in the previous two presentations. But if a lightning stroke comes down and within 100 meters or so of the ground, forks and hits 2 points simultaneously, those are not included in these calculations, which could result in some underestimates of the number of ground strike points. Here's the map of ground strike points per year in the United States. This follows, again, very similarly, the number of strokes and the number of flashes per square kilometer per year. The United States does have two large mountain ranges, one in the eastern United States, the Appalachians, and then in the western United States, the Rocky Mountains. The elevations in the western United States are significantly higher than in the eastern United States, and you can definitely see the impact of that with a lower number of ground strike points. That'll be both less lightning occurring there and some of the things that Dieter mentioned, resulting in lower number of ground strike points in those areas. And again, you see that along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains as well. But number of ground strike points ranging from regions that don't see any lightning per year up to those that see 16 or 18 per square kilometer per year over central and eastern Florida, the peninsula that's sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean there. So a big discrepancy or a big change of the amount of lightning across the United States, which is well known to people in the U.S. And certainly has impacts on exactly the types of lightning protection or the lightning, what lightning preparedness takes place across the United States. We've also gone through and shown the number of ground strike points per flash on this 2 kilometer gridded map as well. And you'll see across the central and northern plains this wide swath of blue, which is below our 1.6 ground strike points per flash average across the United States, related to some differences in the charge structure of thunderstorms that occur in that part of the United States. And this is really a good description of, do we over or underestimate the lightning risk? And certainly dependent on where you are and what correction factor you may have used for flash density to ground strike point density, you could very well overestimate or underestimate the lightning risk in any given area in the United States, which really showcases why these new calculations that we're able to do with ground-based lightning networks are so important. You don't want to underestimate your risk and use less protection than necessary and run the risk of damage. But lightning protection is also very expensive at times, and you don't want to overestimate and over protect if you don't need to and you're in a cost-sensitive environment. So having these new values and having these values mapped out will really go to support lightning protection, whether it's in the United States, Europe, South Africa, or where there are suitably performing lightning detection networks to go through and calculate these sorts of values on a global scale. I do want to zoom in on the Appalachians area here. We're looking at the Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia area. If you're familiar with the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, that's where this is located. And again, this really zooms in towards that high terrain to low terrain area. As you get east of the swaths of blue, you're getting towards the Piedmont area, lower elevations near the ocean. The blue is the spine of the mountains. And you can definitely see on this high resolution map how lightning strikes to the earth are differing based on terrain factors, as well as some meteorological factors that come into play based on just instability and things like that related to the mountain ranges. So this is where I end my presentation. Again, this was a really great thing for SAIEE to put together to showcase all of this great work that's been going on across the planet with respect to understanding our ground strike points better and how we can use that to improve lightning protection, lightning safety. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'll answer any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much. And yeah, really appreciate your contribution here. Right. I don't have any questions that have popped up during the presentation, but if anyone's got something to add in there, let's give it 5 seconds. Just while I wait for something to pop in, just a question from my side. Yeah, I found that was very interesting in that map. And as you go more south, essentially away from the mountains towards, I mean, that's not a major change in altitude or anything happening there, is it?
As you go towards like the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic there?
Yes, yeah, so less on the east coast side or west coast side, you know, just more centrally, as you said, you notice that major difference between the ratio of GSPs per flash. But that's not really tied to an altitude.
No, not
over
the central and northern plains. That's not so much a change in altitude across that broad area or change in elevation. There's been work done in the 20 teens diving into that inverted charge structure or some differing charging of thunderstorms in that region, where we see more positive flashes than negatives, which as I was saying, around 1.15 ground strike points per flash for positive flashes. So if you have an area with more significant positive flashes, you'll have much fewer ground strike points.
Interesting. Okay. Right, there's a question from Mike Fisser here saying, thanks, Chris. Is your accuracy a function of sensors compared to the SAIEE or Euclid accuracies?
So the NLDN accuracy, that is through continuous development and performance reviews and working on upgrades to the algorithms primarily. So Dr. Martin Murphy and Dr. Ryan Said in Vizsla, who own and operate the National Lightning Detection Network, they're consistently working on new techniques to improve the performance of the NLDN.
Thanks. Another question coming here. Is there a synchronized standard that can be used across the different regions, or we are to follow only local standards? And this is asked by Walter Moilwa.
Well, I believe that the IEC standards, which are going through an update right now, those would be generally the kind of the universal standard to be used for the performance of the lightning detection network to be used, or for the ground strike point algorithm or anything like that. So Hugh, maybe you may know a little bit more about the status of those IEC updates.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's an interesting question, and especially in your presentation, and also someone asked the question on Sanelli's, the difference between the west of South Africa and the east, seeing a large difference in essentially I think the recommendation in the new standards will be to take your flash density value and scale it by 2 in order to try and account for ground strike point density. But as you've shown very clearly in your presentation, that might not exactly cover the whole. That doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. I suppose it's an over-design metric, and that was probably the decision, is that rather be safe than sorry. But it is an interesting point. There's a question here: can a GSP per flash be less than 1, and how, as seen in one of the slides?
Yes, and that is a function of, I'll cite a number that Dieter gave, which was a median separation of 2.3 kilometers, and they range from 900 meters up to 5.5 kilometers. And if you are using a gridding of 2 kilometers, you will have some instances where your ground strike point to another ground strike point will be in different grid cells. That can be corrected if you use a larger gridding. So if you did a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid, or if you just averaged some neighboring grids together. So yes, that is a function of the gridding, and it can be changed through some calculations.
I haven't had a new question pop in, so I'm just going to revisit the 2 questions I wasn't able to tackle earlier, but I think they're relevant. So Sanelli, you can jump in here as well, but they're relevant to everyone, really. The first one was, how prevalent are lightning damages, in particular damages on PV plants relating with density maps? And that was from Jeremiah Methabela. I don't know about your experience in the US, Chris. I know I'm hearing more and more about PV plants in South Africa having challenges with lightning, and I'm hearing also the story that often they are sort of experiencing more lightning issues than they designed for, they expected in the design, and it makes me wonder if that is a GSP type sort of miscalculation, but I don't know if you've heard about anything in the US. Or...
in the US, we don't have quite the number of solar that we do with wind energy, and we have significant issues with wind energy and turbines being struck. A lot of our PV generation is over the southwestern United States, where there is less lightning and a lot more sun. It is a desert region, so that certainly goes to protect some of that. But yeah, as there's a focus on renewable production in the United States, we'll start to see things that are placed in more lightning-prone regions, and that will have to be taken into design considerations, and having now these high-resolution ground strike point density maps, you can use that to now take into account.
Right. No more questions have popped up here, so I think we can essentially end our session here. Chris, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And a thank you to Dieter and Sanelli as well. Really appreciate everyone being able to come and talk to, as you said, Chris, some very interesting research that's been done, and very nice to see these things starting to become published maps that people can refer to. A final question from Matthew. Ralph, if a lightning protection system is designed for flashes as opposed to strike points, would that render the protection useless?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's dependent on the correction factor that is used in that. If you're in a very high lightning density area, and it's you've used the correction factor of 1.2, 1.3, when you have actually a 2 to 3 ground strike points per flash, then it's not useless, but it's not as potent a protection as it could be. If you're in a low ground strike point density area and you've used a correction factor of 2, but your ground strike points is 1 to 1.2, then you've overprotected, and that'll potentially be of benefit. Of course, nothing is ever perfect, so those are things to take into consideration as well.
Definitely. A last question here. It's in South Africa, we didn't have a dedicated SAN standard for PV plants lightning protection. Is there IEC standards or US standards that can be applied for now? I know there is an IEC standard for lightning protection, or at least one of the IEC standards covering PV talks to some lightning protection. It's not adopted in South Africa at this point. Do you know if there's something similar in the US, Chris?
I don't know if there's a specific US one. I would imagine that it falls back to the IEC standard.
Okay. And then finally, will the presentations be made available? As far as I understand, they will be available on on YouTube, on the SAIEE webpage. Minx can correct me there if I'm wrong. Right.
Yes, thank you. Just to answer that question, if you would like the presentations, please email minx@saiee.org.za and I will send a PDF of the presentation to you. Thank you.
Great. I think with that, Minx, we can essentially wrap up for today. Thank you very much to everyone for joining. Thank you to our presenters. Really appreciate your time. And thank you for a very valuable webinar.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.